10 years had passed since his first encounter, but the memories remained vivid, fueled by a cryptid community now ablaze with similar stories. Jake, once skeptical, found himself drawn deeper into the mystery, connecting the dots between missing persons, Dogman sightings, and the feral humans he'd encountered. 3 years ago, the concept of a Dogman was foreign to him. He'd initially dismissed the creature as a mutated wolf. But then he stumbled upon the Missing 411 series by David Paulides, and countless others attempting to explain the unexplained disappearances of people. It didn't take long for him to connect those vanishings to the wild men, Dogman, and what he later came to call them, feral people. He remembered watching the Hills Have Eyes movies and marveling at how accurately they depicted what a society of these feral people could be like. Though the movie exaggerated their strength, Jake couldn't help but think meth could easily account for that. Meth labs were quite common in rural areas, especially deep in the mountains and hollers of Tennessee, the Carolinas, and even from Florida to Minnesota. They were everywhere. The tenacity of these people, willing to face a gun and lose a few lives without blinking, was something Jake knew firsthand. It wasn't much of a leap to imagine moonshine distilleries of the early 2000s being converted to meth labs as demand for the product grew. Even seemingly civilized people could commit brutal acts of violence after long-term meth use. It rewires your brain chemistry. Feral men and women who once might have been content taking moonshine from others could now be devouring meth like candy. That was his theory anyway, and if a bunch of teenage pot dealers knew about these people, Jake was sure the moonshiners and meth cooks did too. Theories aside, Jake needed answers. On November 1st, 2023, he used a small settlement to buy the gear he needed: 2 trail cams, a Sony FX30 with a Tamron lens, GoPros, body cams, and enough survival supplies to stay on that mountain as long as it took. He also bought a harness and pack for his German Shepherd, Chevy. Chevy was getting older, but Jake figured he could join him for one last adventure before retiring to the comforts of indoor life. One thing Jake learned from his last encounter was that he needed to be better armed. This time, he came prepared. His modified Romanian AK-47 was decked out with flashlights, laser pointers, a red dot sight, and even a thermal scope. He also brought along a 1911 Kimber 45 caliber pistol and a 40 caliber Smith & Wesson, both with laser sights and extended magazines. He wasn't taking any chances. 6 clips for the AK, 3 clips each for the pistols, and his backup, a 12-gauge shotgun with a folding stock strapped to Chevy. He rigged up a belt with Velcro on either side of Chevy, carrying shells ranging from double buckshot to slugs and even dragon's breath. When Jake contacted Ray, he learned Ray and his brothers had scattered, no longer living in North Carolina. Ray was closest, in Tennessee. Jake loaded up his truck and headed straight for Ray's place. Ray was in rough shape, living in a sort of halfway house with one other guy. His addiction had taken a toll on him. Jake crashed on the couch for a few days, catching up, and then he laid out his plan. When Ray saw Jake's arsenal and all the gear, he shook his head and called him crazy, but he also knew Jake was serious. After about a week, Ray took him to a spot where he said it was almost impossible not to encounter them. He told Jake about hunters and others who had gone missing up there, and as they drove, Ray shared something chilling. The boys hadn't heard from their dad in a while, and when they went to check, he was gone. Just vanished. They believed he went into the mountains to die, but Ray's words told another story.
We say that, but deep down I know they killed him.
It was the reason for Ray's addiction, and the reason he couldn't go with Jake. He hadn't set foot in the woods in over 5 years. Chevy and Jake made good time, reaching the spot just before dark. Jake set up the tent and trail cams, keeping everything low-key, no fire. Chevy stayed in the tent, and they both slept better than expected. Early in the morning, a low growl rumbled from Chevy's throat, waking Jake up. The sun was barely peeking through the trees. Jake grabbed his pistol, shining the light outside, but nothing was there. He stepped out and lit a flare, tossing it onto a pile of sticks he'd gathered the night before. Chevy followed, staring intently at the thick brush.
If someone's out there and this dog gets a hold of you, he's going for the neck. You better show yourself.
Jake raised his pistol, pointing at the laser where Chevy's gaze was fixed. Chevy crept forward and Jake followed, careful to step heel first, keeping his movements quiet. Suddenly, Chevy let out an intense growl, and 2 sets of feet took off running. Jake had forgotten that Chevy was attached to him by a thick Kong leash. He almost yanked Jake off his feet as he lunged after them. Jake managed to keep his balance, and Chevy glanced back at him, almost annoyed. Jake reached for his AR Stinger crossbow, hoping to catch a glimpse of the intruders. The thick brush gave way to a prairie-like clearing filled with large boulders, but they were gone. Their footsteps faded within minutes, swallowed by the forest. They had to be hiding in the thicket. Jake fired an arrow in the direction they had run.
Next time, motherfucker. I let him go.
He yelled. That morning, Jake packed up and headed higher into the mountains. There was a rest spot a few miles up, and Chevy stayed on edge the entire way. When they arrived, another group of hikers was already there. Jake sized them up, wondering if they were the type to steal, but they were friendly, despite his cold demeanor. He told them what had happened, and they offered to feed him and let him join them at first light. They ate, but Jake told them he had more ground to cover. He felt a little better knowing they were behind him. About an hour into the hike, Jake thought he heard a scream, but the wind was whistling so loudly he convinced himself it was nothing. He never saw those hikers again, even after waiting at the rest spot for 3 days. 3 long, miserable days. It rained the first night and most of the next day, so Jake and Chevy stayed in the tent, only venturing out to relieve themselves. The tent was large, held up by a single rod in the center, and anchored by sharpened sticks with rocks and mud packed around them. Jake had strung a line around the clearing, and game cams were set up, but there was no service to check the footage. He had a small furnace vented through the tent to keep them warm, but Chevy wouldn't settle. He kept growling and pointing, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. It finally stopped raining around 1 a.m. Jake woke up instantly, and he knew something was off. The tent flap was open, with a tarp over the front to keep rain out. He always kept it that way. Chevy was whining, gnawing at his lower back. He couldn't stand. Jake was mind-fucked. Jake picked up his AK, switched on the tactical flashlight, and stepped outside. He could hear movement in the distance. Aligning the flashlight with the laser pointer, Jake scanned the area. 30 yards away he saw him, a filthy man, his face disfigured, covered in burn scars. He looked like a twisted version of Freddy Krueger, dressed in some kind of robe. He held a pole in his hand. Jake aimed the laser at his chest.
What'd you do to my fucking dog?
The man just stared, then barked at him. Barked. Jake was mind-fucked all over again. The pole reminded him of a dart gun, but he couldn't prove anything.
Get the fuck away from here before I kill you for this, motherfucker.
He aimed between the man's feet and fired. The man got the message, disappearing into the woods. Suddenly, the forest erupted with the sound of bipedal footsteps retreating from the tent. Jake turned to see 3 more figures, 2 men and a woman, covered in mud, running away. They had been closer than the first guy. He was the distraction while they tried to sneak up on Jake. He'd found what he came for, but at a terrible cost. Jake brewed Chevy a tea using wild lettuce, hoping it would ease his pain. He'd seen something similar before. An old dog of his drank motor oil once, and it messed him up the same way. It dawned on Jake then, Chevy must have been shot with a dart. He found a small bone fragment, possibly a fish rib, in Chevy's fur. Jake cleaned the wound as best he could, using hydrogen peroxide and squeezing it until morning. Chevy was a trooper, but Jake could see the fight leaving him. Once they got down the mountain, Jake took Chevy to the vet. Jake told the entire story to the vet. The vet dismissed his account, claiming the dog simply had hip dysplasia and suggesting that Jake must have been imagining things. She added with a warning tone that if she were him, she'd keep quiet about all this. This did not stop. Whatever they shot Chevy with, from causing too much damage, Jake had lost Chevy. The rage inside him was unbearable, and after a week of grieving, Jake knew he had to return to that mountain. Jake went back for the trail cams. He had hidden them well and needed to know what was on them. But as soon as he got close, park rangers intercepted him. They detained him, holding him for 24 hours. Only then did they allow him to go back and even taunted him, saying good luck surviving a day out there with what's left of your equipment. He was followed by the park rangers to the trailhead, stopped, taken to a nearby conservation post, interrogated and held for 24 hours. It wasn't an official jail, it was some cabin where they interrogated him endlessly. They made Jake sign 9 different forms warning him to stay away from those woods. They knew exactly where his campsite was, and it was clear they had taken the trail cam memory cards. They were deliberately trying to cover their tracks and ensure that Jake couldn't prove anything. But Jake wasn't done. He went back anyway. When he arrived, his tent was still standing, but most of his supplies were gone. The trail cams were there, but the memory cards had vanished. It was as if they knew exactly what he was after and made sure to take it. They wanted Jake to stay quiet. They didn't want the proof getting out. But Jake wasn't about to stay quiet. He would find a way to tell the world what was really up there, no matter how many forms they made him sign or how many threats they threw at him. After everything, Jake packed up, knowing it was pointless to fight right then. He had lost Chevy and needed to regroup. He was determined to return, but for now, he had to prepare. The authorities wanted to break him, but he wasn't going to let them. If you've ever faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale, Deadnetstudios wants to hear from you. Your story could be the key to understanding the truth behind what lurks in the shadows. Share your experience at deadnetstudios@gmail.com and help us expose the secrets that hide in the wilderness. Remember, in a world where creatures like the wild men exist, ignorance isn't bliss, it's a death sentence. Knowledge is survival. Stay vigilant, stay alive, and to Chevy, wherever you are, thank you. You were the best boy, and you'll never be forgotten.
In the shadows of the digital night, we've wandered far and seen some sights, from haunting tales to eerie lights. Deadnetstudios where fear ignites. So long, farewell from the crimson hollows. We'll be back again with more tales to follow. Keep the lights dimmed and your curiosity high. For in Deadnet's realm, the spirits never die. We've danced with ghosts, chased legends on, through cryptic codes, stories untold. In cyberspace where mysteries unfold, our journey's been daring, brave and bold. So long, farewell from the darkened halls, where shadows whisper and the unknown calls. Keep your eyes wide and your mind astir, for the mysteries of Deadnet are a haunting blur. In the world of strange and the unexplained, we find our stories wildly untamed. With each video's end, we take a little rest. We find the shackles every best.